This is a story that really kind of stopped us in our tracks,
Yeah.
and we knew we needed to do a deep dive on it.
Absolutely.
We see these headlines all the time, sadly, especially over the past, gosh, almost 10 years now,
Right.
about Yazidis being rescued from captivity.
Right.
But this one stood out, and I think you know why.
Yes, absolutely.
It's Fawzia Amin Sido, and she's 21 years old now.
Very young.
But the really remarkable part is she was rescued, I should say,
Right.
from Gaza.
Of all places.
Yeah, and that immediately raises questions.
Yes, yeah. The Yazidi genocide, as horrible as it was perpetrated by ISIS in Iraq and Syria, primarily in 2014.
Yeah.
So to see a story like Fawzia's and to see that she had been taken captive, during that time, and then ends up in Gaza, what's the connection there? How did that happen?
Right. And, we should probably just take a step back. And I know a lot of our listeners are familiar with this, but I think it's worth just giving that background of what happened in 2014.
Absolutely, yeah. So ISIS, they were really at the height of their power at that time, and they swept through Sinjar, which is a region in northern Iraq where many Yazidis live.
Right. And this was like their caliphate. This was like their the area they were trying to control.
Exactly. Yeah, this is where they were trying to establish their so-called caliphate.
Right.
And, the Yazidis were targeted specifically because of their religious beliefs.
Right. And that's what makes it a genocide, not just, any other kind of horrible atrocity.
Right. It was systematic, it was widespread, and it was clearly intended to destroy the Yazidi people.
Right. I mean, we saw the images, we heard the stories of mass killings and sexual violence.
Yeah. And tens of thousands of Yazidis were forced to flee their homes.
Yeah, right.
Many of them still living in displacement camps.
Yeah. And so Fawzia was 11 when she was taken from Sinjar.
11 years old. Can you imagine?
No, it's unimaginable. And for all those years, her family had no idea where she was.
Right. Just complete silence.
And then during this recent conflict, the Israel-Hamas conflict, we get this glimmer of hope.
Yeah, I mean, talk about bittersweet, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have this horrible conflict unfolding, but then in the midst of that,
this opportunity
arises, yeah.
Because her captor, presumably whoever took her from Sinjar, was killed in an airstrike.
Yeah. Right. Presumably, we don't know all the details, but that seems to be what happened.
Right. But of course, she's still in Gaza.
Exactly. Still trapped.
Still in a war zone.
Yes, and that's where it gets even more complicated, right?
Right.
Because how did she even end up in Gaza?
Right.
Was she taken there directly? Was she moved between different groups? There's speculation about human trafficking networks.
Right. It really shows you the extent of this network of just awful, awful things that was going on.
Absolutely. And we may never have those answers. But what we do know is that she's now free. And that's thanks in part to some unusual international cooperation.
Right. I mean, the fact that Israel, the U.S., and other groups were able to work together, even in the middle of this conflict.
Right, putting aside their differences.
To secure her release is pretty remarkable.
It really is a testament to the power of human compassion and what can be accomplished when we prioritize life above all else.
But it's so important, I think, to emphasize, as you said, this is one story, one good outcome.
Right.
But there's so many others still out there.
Exactly. Thousands, as we said.
Yeah. And, I was reading this article, I think it was in the New York Times, that talked about how, and this is just horrifying, how Yazidi women were being bought and sold in marketplaces.
Yeah, it's sickening the way they were treated.
Like property.
Exactly. As commodities, not as human beings.
And that's what makes this genocide so, so horrific.
Absolutely. And, we talk about Fawzia and we celebrate her rescue.
Right.
But we can't forget about the ongoing trauma, the families that are still torn apart, the thousands who are still missing.
Right. And that's really what we wanted to leave people with, is just this thought of what happens now.
Right.
For Fawzia, but also for all the other families who are still waiting, still hoping.
And for the Yazidi community as a whole, how do they rebuild after such a devastating loss?
Right. And I think that's a question that we all need to sit with. And it's not an easy one, but it's one that we can't ignore.
It's a reminder to stay informed, to stay engaged, and to continue to fight for justice and accountability.
Absolutely.
Because this isn't just history, it's still happening.
It is, and we can't let the world forget.
We can't.
And on that note, we will leave it there
Thanks.
For this incredibly important deep dive.
Thank you for having me.